and we're going to be talking about security and networks in cyberspace. Now, you heard about the disinformation side, you heard about crisis management. Now we're going to talk more about how the security is to protect these very, very important networks, protect the integrity of information, being able to stop social media operations, detect them, and we have important speakers speaking on this matter.
Let me introduce our moderator first, our colleague Cafer Hasnain. He's a presenter at TRT World. Ladies and gentlemen, you'll be shortly welcoming him to the stage. And in the meantime, let me introduce our esteemed speakers. Akın Ünver, Governing Council member of the International Studies Association. Ersin Çahmutoğlu, Cybersecurity Researcher at EDIO. Mark A. Smith, Director at Social Media Research Foundation. Oleg Shakirov, Senior Expert at Center for Advanced Governance. Cafer will be with you shortly. Enjoy your session.
And welcome to this important panel. My name is Cafer Hasnain, and I want to lighten up the mood here a bit first. Let's start this panel with a question. And I want your participation in this before I move to my panelists. Do you feel your information is safe on the internet? Raise your hands. Do you feel your information, your personal data, is safe on the internet? So I just saw one person. Another one, Chari Gunal from TRT World, he also raises his hand. He believes his information is safe. So certainly most of you feel that your information is not safe on the internet. So we're going to be talking about security in the cyber world, in the cyberspace. Let me remind you all who we have with us today here, joining us virtually on this panel. Akın Ünver, Governing Council member of the International Studies Association. Ersin Çahmutoğlu, Cybersecurity Researcher at ADEO. Mark A. Smith, Director at Social Media Research Foundation. And Oleg Shakirov, Senior Expert at the Center for Advanced Governance. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us, but I believe there is one person missing. I hope they join us soon. Now, I want to begin with you, Akın. What's the best way to ensure security in the cyber world?
Well, beginning with the question, is our information safe in cyberspace? Well, I don't feel my information being secure with all types of archival documentation anyway, like papers and old forms of archival research. So basically, what is the alternative, right? So if we're not using internet with our data, what alternatives do we have for our data to be transmitted at this kind of scale and this kind of speed? We have none. So essentially, we have to make a decision, right? So internet is a new form of data transmission. And when we look at history of civilization and history of technologies, any kind of new technology had initial hiccups when it was first introduced. Probably the most different thing about the internet is that it was introduced very rapidly compared to other forms of data transmission, such as telex, such as fax, such as phones, such as telegram. During World War I, for example, every combatant side hijacked each other's telegram communication. So it wasn't that difficult to do even at that time. So, was telegram communication safe or secure, right? When we look from the perspective of 1913 and 1914, and we're going to say that it wasn't, but over time they became secure. So essentially, we're looking at an evolutionary process here. Right now, yes, we have hackers, we have data dumps. Part of this problem is due to hackers, yes, but the other part of the problem is how governments, how companies try to protect that data. Most of the time, it's the fault of improper data protection practices that ended up getting those data hacked. So basically, how do we make things more secure? How do we make data more secure in cyberspace? Is practically we invest more in cybersecurity. I mean, that's the very short answer in that regard. And it has different parameters, better data transmission infrastructure, basically investing in that, better cybersecurity professionals. That's one of the most rarest commodities out there in the world today. Both technology companies, governments, media companies compete over high quality human capital over better cybersecurity professionals, and that those are really hard to come by. And basically getting citizens themselves probably raising awareness among them and get them educated in that regard. Who are they submitting their data to? If they're submitting it to a social media company, for example, what are their data protection practices? Most of us don't read those things, but maybe as more personal data gets hacked, more data gets dumped over the dark web in that regard, maybe people will become eventually more aware of how their data are being handled. And I see this as an evolutionary process. How are we going to get more secure in cyberspace? In time, basically, as more scandals erupt, as more data gets dumped, people are going to basically demand these things from institutions where they send their data to be stored, and also institutions that take that data and store. So that's basically my take.
Okay. Now, as I understand from what you said, Akin, investment is the key word here. But what can we do on an individual level, Mark, in order to protect our data in the cyber world?
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Mark Smith. I'm a sociologist, and so I take a slightly broader view over the concept of security. I appreciate that one concept of security is controlling who has access to information. You have private information, you want to deny access to that information to others. There's another concept of security, which is the quality of the information. And in some cases, this is public information. So it's not about denying access to others to that information. It's more about the quality of that information. So we are in the midst of what seems to be a disinformation crisis, in which information systems like the internet turn out not to have opinions about high quality versus low quality information. And so things like masks don't work, or the virus is a fake, that's low quality information, but it travels equally as fast and maybe faster on the internet than high quality information. And so the question I think is worth asking is, in what way can we build infrastructures for the creation of high quality information, not just information? And so securing low quality information is somewhat self-defeating. So securing high quality information seems to be the goal. And so I just add to this discussion a dimension of the quality of that information. And this touches to the notion of collective epistemology. How do we know what we know? How do we know what's real? And my argument would be that the internet has given us a system in which there are no more gatekeepers. And in some ways that is a good thing. But what we really need now are the creation of new ways of gatekeeping, some way of actually putting a filter on low quality information so that the great middle of the population of all of our nations are not easily misled by essentially low quality information that now travels very freely. So the security and the quality of information, I think, are both critical topics of discussion.
Okay. Now, Oleg, let me come to you. Now, you are a senior expert at the Center for Advanced Governance. So tell me, to what extent governments across the world have control over the cyberspace?
Thank you, and thank you to all the other speakers. I think it's a very good question, because we see over the past decade that governments in many countries, they definitely attempt to have more control over what's happening in cyberspace, both in the control of what happens to their critical systems, but also their control of what information is spread on the internet, and control of the quality of information, something that Mark now spoke about. And we see that there are attempts of different measure of success. Some are more successful. So, for example, in some countries, we see that governments can temporarily shut down internet during some kind of a crisis. So this demonstrates that in some contexts, governments can actually control this information environment. But in other contexts, we see that governments have a very limited control, because I think that this idea of control confronts the idea of the internet, because internet is supposed to be this global interconnected system, and so ensuring that one has control over what's happening on this network is difficult. But as we move forward, I believe that the role of governments will be crucial, not only nationally, but primarily internationally. We see now that many governments introduce cybersecurity policies, and they are far more advanced than we've seen several years ago. So now all the new regulation in the United States or in Russia, where I'm from, we see that there is much more detail in this new attempt to regulate the internet. But you can do only that much on the national level, because many problems are transnational, and you cannot solve them nationally. Just to give you an example, there was a recent study by a cybersecurity company where they looked at discussions on Russian-speaking hacker forums, and they discovered that some users of those forums, they were very concerned about potential Russian-US cooperation in the law enforcement area, that this would kind of harm their activities. So I was surprised to find out that the hackers are probably the most optimistic about the prospects of Russian-US cooperation. Everyone else is kind of pessimistic about this. But this shows you that there are different kind of factors, different kind of phenomena that can be only tackled if we cooperate. And so I believe that in addition to this national regulation, where governments can definitely succeed, the international level will be crucial to ensuring global cybersecurity.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Let me come to my audience for a second. Guys, would you like to see more government control in the cyberspace or not? Raise your hands if you would like to see more government control. I see 2 hands, but the rest, no. So certainly not many people want government's involvement in the cyberspace. So, Akin, in that case, if the general opinion of the public is against government control, how do we make the cyberspace secure? Who implements the policy?
Well, you should ask the question to the audience again after, for example, a terrorist attack or a natural disaster. What ends up happening is that after crisis incidents that are very emotional or that involve a lot of crisis that affects a lot of people, people's evaluations of the government's role on the internet and social media tends to change. Basically, that's what recent scientific scholarship is basically talking about. You know, the sample, for example, that argues that the government should stay out of internet, shouldn't regulate, will change its opinion after a crisis incident that affects them. When there's a lot of, for example, disinformation or information overload, then they tend to say that no, government should actually be more involved in the internet. So context matters a lot. You know, in one context, when there's no crisis, there's no panic, people will say that, yeah, government should stay out of internet regulation. And one reason they say that is that most people don't think that governments understand the internet very well. So that's why they don't trust the kind of regulation that comes from most governments. I would say all governments, but here's the trick. That kind of view tends to change.
If I may interject,
Yeah.
Now, you say that most
Mm-hmm.
people think that governments do not understand the internet. Now, that's the perception. How do you think that perception was created among the public?
Basically, well, based on the studies that we have in political communication, one of the main reasons why people think that governments don't get the internet is that governments try to still rely on things like censorship or internet restrictions that don't work at all. There's scientific evidence that neither censorship nor internet throttling nor content moderation actually changes the way people consume information on digital space. So basically attempts like that end up making governments look bad. So governments are actually moving away from that kind of policy. But alternatively, most governments don't know what to do when, again, I'm talking about within the context of emergencies like crises, natural disasters, protests, riots, and there's an earthquake or a terrorist attack. When those things happen, people's perception of both the internet and the government's role of the internet change quite a lot. And even though most people understand that the government doesn't get the internet because most governments still try to solve the internet issue through restrictions and censorship, when there's a sufficient emotionally triggering crisis, they don't care. They just say, government, move in, whatever, restrict this account, restrict that account. These people shouldn't be sharing these things on the internet. So I think rather than saying that should governments be more involved in the internet or not, we should talk rather about under what conditions or in which context should governments be more involved on the internet. And I think that's a more interesting debate that we should be talking about.
Okay. Mark, now we have been talking about
right.
how most of the governments do not understand the internet. When we say most, it means there are certainly some countries, some governments, which get it right.
Maybe.
Which governments are those?
I think we might want to rephrase the question to our audience. Does the government have a role to play in ensuring that water is clean?
Okay.
Does the government have a role to play to ensure that automobiles on your highways conform to minimal safety requirements? And I think we would agree, yes. Now, does every nation do a very good job of setting automobile standards and regulations? No. And in fact, many nations simply adopt the standards and practices of other nations. And so if you can sell your car in the EU or in the US, there's a really good chance that you can sell it elsewhere. And so certain organizations, certain entities, nation states have different and higher standards for safety equipment. So I think one observation is that all technologies have negative externalities. Steam engines exploded for 150 years until we got much better at making steam engines. And even then, steam engines continue to explode. I'll point to Fukushima and note that while it is nuclear powered, it's still a steam engine. It exploded. And so we are in that interesting era in which there's rapid technical change, yes, but not rapid mitigation and the safety technologies. And so in many ways, I like to think of these things like automobiles and ask the question, where are the safety belts? Where are the airbags? Where are the roll cages for information systems? And if we ask ourselves, well, I don't even know what that would look like, that is a sign that we are in the early days. If you saw the early Model T Ford, it had no airbag. And when people saw that vehicle, they did not immediately say, but where is the airbag? It took decades to develop this concept of airbag. And so in many ways, information systems like the internet and social media have created a kind of marketplace of ideas. And that's a nice metaphor, a marketplace of ideas, because it then leads us to ask the question, where is the accounting software for this marketplace of ideas? In the absence of accounting software, what would you expect would happen in a marketplace? That's a rhetorical question. The answer is rampant fraud. And so it is true that the presence of an accounting system is not sufficient. We still have fraud in marketplaces, in financial marketplaces, even though we have accounting systems. But imagine what it would be like if we did not have accounting systems. And so it is a necessary but not sufficient ingredient of higher quality information systems that we have some kind of accounting system. And right now, there is no accounting system for the marketplace of ideas, and thus we are subject to rampant fraud. And that's a problem because some misinformation and disinformation is actually lethal. It's really disruptive. And so I do think government has a role to play, but like the role it plays with clean water or safe automobiles, it's a regulatory one in which it should set standards for outcomes. If a car hits a wall at 35 miles an hour, the people should survive. We should say the same kinds of things to the platforms. If people come to your platform and try to spread misinformation, it should resist in some way. And how that happens may not be for us to define, but that it should happen would be.
Right. Okay. I just feel fraud is so common these days and that we're not doing enough to counter it. I just want to ask my audience, how many of you have become victims to fraud on the internet? No one.
Please include the concept of information fraud.
Yep. And
which
so
is to say you were told
I
something
think
that was
I see
allegedly
one hand
true
there.
and it turns out not to be.
Okay, so not many here, which is good. So congratulations. I hope you never become victims to fraud. That's not a good thing because I have. Now, Oleg, I want to come to you. I want to broaden this discussion a bit. You're joining us from Russia. I don't want to turn this into a political discussion, but I do have to say Russia has been accused by some countries, including the United States, of launching cyber attacks against other countries. While I don't want to make this discussion country-specific, I do want to ask you, can the cyber world be used to launch attacks against other countries?
Yeah, and thank you for not turning this political in any way. But I think that, of course, the question is rather simple. I can just say yes, and we can continue with our discussion. But let me highlight several points. So the idea that cyberspace or information space can be used to launch attacks against other countries can be new to some people, but actually it has been around for 2 or maybe 3 decades already. Actually, one organization which I consult for, Peer Center, it published a book in 2001. And I recently reread that book 2 decades ago. And it lists many examples of how states can exploit this new domain for their purposes and how they can launch cyber attacks. So indeed, this is true, and we've seen several examples. One notable thing is that there is so far no example where one state accepted some responsibility for launching such attacks. Well, there are some examples. For example, President Trump in 2019 or maybe 2020, he has accepted that he had launched some kind of attack against Russian actors in the midst of 2018 midterm elections. But this is as far as it can go. We see no states accepting these actions, but still we know from reports of journalists, of security companies that this happens. So there is this slow evolution that is not very visible to the general public. And now we continue to see many countries investing in what they call cyber defenses. So I'm not only talking about what Akin already spoke about before, about greater awareness of these problems, about technical capabilities, but I'm talking about military institutions. So, for example, we've recently heard from Switzerland that they're creating some kind of new cyber battalion. So every month there is a new story about a new country which creates some kind of new allegedly defensive unit. But in one recent presentation, I called it the cyber equivalent of Chekhov's gun. So a gun that is on the wall, and since it's on the wall in the beginning of the play, it should be fired at some point. So the situation is definitely becoming more dangerous, and the fact that there is very little understanding in the general public about these issues, and that there is little transparency in this field makes it more dangerous in my understanding.
Okay. So the situation is indeed very serious. Akin, now, especially since 2016, there's been a lot of talk about intervention in elections, hacking of political parties' servers. How can a government, a country, avoid from this to occur? What can it do? Or there's no way it can be avoided because hackers they're going to keep trying.
I think it's a universal problem. I mean, yes, there's a big debate about Russia and often China doing disinformation or cyber, but these things aren't unique to Russia or China. I mean, this is a very universal way of political competition in international arena, and most of the time, what we call infrastructures for cyber defense are not very distinguishable from infrastructures of cyber offense. So, when we have an air defense system, yes, we can say it's for defense because you can't really, attack another country with an anti-air missile, right? But we can't really say the same thing for cyber capabilities. The kind of infrastructure capabilities, human capital, hardware and software that you would use for cyber defense can be deployed for cyber offense as well. In terms of intentions, in terms of practices, these things are really not unique to Russia. I mean, any country meddles with the election of any other country, cyber or otherwise. It's a very traditional way of political competition between countries in international relations. And the most surprising part of this to me is, why is this all of a sudden such a surprising thing? Yes, countries do meddle in each other's elections since, I don't know, the invention of elections and democracy, I would say. So it's a very universal thing. It's not really that Russia is doing and no other country is doing it. And I think the debate here originates from the fact that China and Russia have become very good at this very quickly. So it caused a kind of international balance of power shift in a way that things you wouldn't expect from Russia and China to do, they can do very easily right now. And I think that's a source of kind of panic in terms of election meddling and whatever. And in the US context, we also saw that allegations of Russian involvement or allegations of Russian intervention can turn into a tool to silence the opposition or silence critiques as well. So there's that kind of a dimension. So the question you ask is very technical. How can governments stop foreign actors from meddling in their own elections? And there's one very straightforward answer to that, which is the answer I gave in the opening remarks, which is basically invest more heavily on cybersecurity and cyber defense. Okay. But I think the kind of secondary answer to this, which is more hidden in that regard, is that in how many countries do we expect the government to protect the cyber systems of opposition parties? And we have to be very real in answering that. So I think that is the real question. Okay.
Now, Mark, you are a director at a social media research sentence. I'm assuming everyone here in the audience uses social media. It has become an integral part of our lives. Tell me, Mark, how do you think social media has been used by foreign actors to meddle in other countries' affairs?
Effectively, that's how. It's been used effectively. Social media makes two promises. No, social media makes one promise, people hear two. It promises that all may speak, but people hear that all may be heard. And that's not true. Only some people get heard in social media. If you can figure out how to be the people who get heard in social media, your message travels much more widely than if you purchased advertising. And so this is a new form of soft power. This is almost like having blue jeans and rock and roll. It's a way of impressing upon other societies your cultural values, your ideas, your points of view. And so for very, very small budget figures, it is possible to create impressions in social media, often through very low levels of collusion. It doesn't take but a few hundred people to share a hashtag in order for that hashtag to be perceived as trending. And so the challenge is that there are almost no gatekeepers. The gatekeepers are largely algorithmic. And if you can overcome the gatekeeper, your meme, your idea, your concept can potentially go viral. And going viral just means that you received the jackpot of advertising dollars for free. Suddenly you get visibility for an idea that otherwise was not going to be visible. So how can social media be used effectively in influence operations? Trivially. I mean, not even with using the advertising systems, which we're aware of, in which you advertise to two separate groups and bring them to the same location in order to have conflict with each other. That's a well-known technique. But what about just the introduction of doubt, uncertainty, and fear into discourses, let's say around the vaccine? Just posting things like, oh, but I heard that somebody down the street had a bad reaction, is a form of disinformation. It erodes public confidence.
Okay.
So it can be
Mark,
used.
if I may interject now, so I believe the question is the question is not can it be used. It is being used, right?
Yes.
Now,
Correct.
to what extent do you think social media giants such as Facebook, Twitter, they are complicit in the crimes of those foreign actors for not taking adequate measures?
There are some arguments for liability, but I would argue that it's similar to the way that auto manufacturers are liable for the deaths and dismemberments of people in auto accidents because the car didn't have proper safety equipment. If the brakes didn't work, if the anti-lock brakes didn't work, if the windshield wipers didn't work, if the headlights didn't work, if the airbag didn't work, if the safety belt didn't work, then it's the responsibility of the auto manufacturer. If you just drive the car off a cliff, it's not their fault. And so I think the argument to be made is, where is the safety equipment that is required on the platform? And if you say, I don't see it, you're right, it's not there. And at the moment, we go to the platforms on a one-at-a-time basis, and we ask them almost like a king to intervene in our conflicts, rather than to demand that they have a process, a machine, a mechanism for the resolution of these conflicts. And why don't they build that machine? Because it's not profitable. And so we should, as nation states, start to define not what the platform should do, but that they should be able to do certain things, like rein back in the flow of disinformation. And I would make an argument that a good design philosophy would be not to give the power to the platform per se, but to give the power of the platform to the users. So we have a white paper out in which we argue that social media users should pick their own editors, not the government and not the platform, but other users of the platform could act as the censors, the filters, the gatekeepers, the editors to remove low quality disinformation. And you as a user would accept that. You would choose who would be your editor. And then you could revoke that right. So this is a concept that puts the responsibility into the hands of individuals and civil society organizations, not going to Mr. Zuckerberg or to whoever is running Twitter today and saying, you should intervene in my conflicts.
Okay, I mean, that's an interesting point that you make, giving the power to the users, but it's a debate in itself, because certainly there are some users out there who are too naive to understand the dynamics of the cyber world. And this is what I want to ask you, Oleg. Is that a good idea?
Thanks. Well, I think this idea is definitely is worthy to consider. And we probably see some examples where it actually exists. For example, Wikipedia has some similar model to what Mark has been describing. But maybe on a more pessimistic note, I think that there are different ways to mitigate these problems. But in general, we are just now living in this very complex world, and these internet-based systems, they add even more complexity. And there is no ultimate solution to these problems. So it's just going to become even more complex, and we will be able to mitigate certain problems that are more pressing now than they would be in a year, or they were last year. And of course, this is not a very stable situation because it's very subjective. For example, this year we've seen major ransomware attacks on critical infrastructure, and now this is a priority for national governments, for bilateral talks between Russia and the United States, etc., etc. But in 2 years, we might see a different kind of trouble that will become the talk of the day. And it doesn't mean that ransomware would be solved by that time. So I think we'll just, it's not very optimistic take, I would like to repeat once again, but we'll be jumping from one crisis to another. Maybe the key idea here is that, as my co-panelists identified, is that some of these technologies are deployed without prior consideration to their safety and security. And maybe this is kind of sort of a natural situation, and we should assume that this will continue to be the case. And so more effort should be invested into thinking about these problems, into making sure that they are more secure, that they are not 100% secure, but that we can find a way to prevent some of the worst outcomes.
Okay. Now, before I move to the last part of our discussion, I just want to get your thoughts on this. What do you think? How would you navigate through this?
We moved across several, domains. Are we now talking about like social media's information security, or are we talking about cybersecurity? Like, I kind of got lost. Like, which particular kind of security are we talking about right now?
Is it a good idea to give power to the users when it comes to cybersecurity?
I mean, theoretically speaking, yes. But based on the kind of experiments that we see in recent political communication research, when we give, my direct answer is yes. But then, like, let's assume we gave everyone, a kind of choice to, curate their own social media feed. And it's a very good idea as far as information and information security is concerned and social media ecosystem health is concerned. The depressing part is that what we see in some experiments is that people get bored and leave the platform when that happens. So I'm still trying to reconcile this with the fact that people engage in a social media environment, partially thinking that what most people are after, if they want to have a civil and normal discussion, most of them do it in an offline situation. Most people do these things in an online fashion. just to have fun, and like the kind of reason that they go to like a football match, right? You know, in a football match, you kind of vent something out. You don't go to a football match and you don't yell things in a civil fashion, because that's what you do in a football match, right? It's a kind of like an emotional discharge system. It's not, you don't go talk politics in a football match when you're like celebrating, you know, that's that kind of environment. So I think what most, you know, governments, companies, social media platforms, and users are kind of trying to find a balance to is that, yes, nobody likes disinformation. Two, nobody likes uncivil political discourse. But when you introduce mechanisms to fix those things, people get bored and disengage and go to another platform where they can just yell at people for whatever reason. And that's the kind of second step that I'm, you know, thinking about. Yes, it's a very good idea as far as solving, you know, step one problem, but it introduces us a step two problem in which the platform becomes civil, discourse becomes civil, no disinformation. Whenever you have disinformation, it's being moderated. People have a choice over the kind of editors that they use, the kind of information flow that they use. At least for now, the kind of experiments that we're doing is that maybe there's a way to make these things more fun. I don't know, but they get bored and they disengage. I think like this is the step two challenge that we have to solve.
Okay, all right, thank you. Okay, now let me stand for the last part of my discussion. And do you guys have any questions? Just want to go to my audience for a second. Any questions? Yeah, I see one hand. Just come here. Just walk up to the stage. That's fine.
I can take it from here.
Sure.
If you allow me.
What's your name?
Associated Professor Ahmet Faruk Çeçen.
Okay.
So it's a really nice topic, and I thank all of the participants over here. My question is, by the way, Marx's idea is very good fun and sounds very good fun, but theoretically, we have seen platforms which have polarized sides. For example, Twitter, Facebook. There are some groups who join and, for example, build on a Facebook page, something like that, and generally in a Facebook page, people come over there and share their similar thoughts. But we have never seen a platform like Trump's new platform. I believe it's called Truth Social. I don't know if you ever heard about it. It will be new platform. And Trump decided to build that one after Twitter banned its account. So I would like to know about what our participants think about it.
About Trump coming up with his own version of social media?
Yeah, Truth Social.
Okay, Mark, I believe this question is for you. Would you like to take it?
So far, competitor platforms that are formed on the basis of a political opposition. Basically, Twitter has removed very far right and violent and incendiary content. And so there are a number of platforms that were created, Parler, Gab, now Truth, I think it is. So far, the history has been pretty negative, as in very low rates of user adoption, very low rates of technical robustness. The platforms go down a great deal. And also, speaking to our broader topic, a very low level of computer security. So in many cases, the login accounts and the details get hacked and leaked. And so let me rephrase your question. How likely is it that competitor platforms will emerge that will meaningfully dispute the market share of existing leaders? Not likely, not likely. As we see it now, all the big platforms will buy up and integrate anything that is an upstart. So if we do see another Instagram, it will probably follow the path of an Instagram and end up being part of Facebook. But I guess I would say, show me the growth numbers in user accounts on Gab and Parler, and then I will say, well, maybe there's a chance for truth. But Oleg has a comment, so let me pass it to him.
Go ahead.
Thanks. I would actually like to highlight an example that worked both ways. So I would like to highlight the Telegram example. So last a year ago, when two things happened. So first, WhatsApp introduced new privacy rules, and a lot of people did not accept it. Actually, I did not accept it until today. And at some point, they decided that they will not ban me from using WhatsApp. But many users after that, they migrated either to Signal or to Telegram or to other platforms. So then what happened in January, we saw the events in Washington, and many kind of Trump supporters and some other right-wing Americans, they were pushed out of Facebook and Twitter. And many of them also migrated to Telegram. So there you go. You see that actually around that time, Turkish president also registered on Telegram, but maybe it's a separate story.
Okay.
So we've seen a great influx to Telegram. But what happened next was that Telegram, which for many years before, they championed the idea of freedom of speech, of like almost absolute freedom of speech, they started to be more active in content moderation, because they were forced by stores, by governments, and maybe by users to invest more in content moderation. So in one way they were this alternative platform, but at the same time they discovered that you cannot be a major platform without following some kind of shared, maybe not unspoken rules of the game. So there you go.
Okay. Now, since you mentioned Telegram, I just want to ask my audience, how many of you use Telegram? Okay, I would say 50%. One more hand in the end. 50%. Okay, before we move on, any other questions, guys? Anyone from the audience? No? Okay. Oh, there is one at the back. Okay, can you please come forward? What's your name?
Yes. My name is Sherhan.
Okay.
Sherhan, yes.
Go ahead.
So, because the topic is about the security, so I'm just really curious about, is it an advantage or disadvantage adding blockchain into the government for
Sorry,
about the security?
Could you say the last sentence again? And just take your mask off because we cannot hear you properly. Yeah, go ahead.
Because it's I saw the topic, it's about the security.
Yep.
So because many people nowadays talking about blockchain in the security. So is it an advantage to add the blockchain into the government for data security? That's all.
Okay, I see you nodding your head, Mark. Would you like to take this one?
I'm a little dubious. I think I might pass it to Aiken, but blockchain is an interesting technology that continues to look for its best application. Things like Bitcoin notwithstanding, a highly energy inefficient system for achieving tasks that can be achieved in other ways. So is blockchain magic secret sauce that makes countries secure and information systems robust and reliable? No.
Okay. Now, let's move to the last part of our discussion, and this is something I have been wondering for a while. I'm going to be specifically talking about social media here for a second. Now, like every kingdom has a downfall, like they say, every kingdom has a downfall. No country in this world can stay in power forever. It has a downfall. Do these social media giants also have a downfall? Will they ever be replaced? Or do you think they are adapting to new technology in the cyber world so quickly that it can never happen? Aken.
Oof, it's such a big question. Companies can always, rise and fall just like big polities do, like kingdoms or states. In that context, it's very hard to forecast because it's, big companies collapsing is both a very context-specific thing, and also when we look at, for example, in order to measure whether big technology companies can basically collapse one day. One good analogy is perhaps how oil and steel and coal companies emerged and disintegrated in late 19th century. That might be some kind of we can draw some kind of an analogy. Basically, new technology, new forms of technological advancements, new types of companies emerging. Some of them become giants and become more powerful than nation states, and then they collapse all of a sudden. I think any company can, rise and fall. But I think even if the idea that is Facebook, the idea that is Instagram, their names may change, but I think these ideas will never disappear. I mean, we are going to have something that fulfills the function of a Twitter. Its name might be different. It can be another company. It can be multiple companies trying to compete for future Twitter's market or Facebook's market.
If I may interject now, are you saying that these companies are going to keep changing themselves like Apple does with its iPhone, launching iPhone 11, iPhone 12, iPhone 13? Is that how it's going to be? Adding more features?
There's some kind of, again, evolutionary aspect to it, because the Facebook that used to be around when I first became part of Facebook, it's an entirely different platform today. So it has evolved quite significantly. Same goes for, I think, Twitter as well, and Instagram as well, and TikTok and other platforms as well. Let's think in terms of this, like, why did MySpace disintegrate? Because MySpace used to be so popular, everyone used to be on MySpace. And well, what happened to MySpace? And my one answer is that it wasn't able to evolve as rapidly as giants like Facebook and Twitter, and it maybe failed to become a huge business. Maybe if it wanted to be a huge business, it would have survived. But I think more recent social media giants are doing a better job at this, but there's no way of saying...
If I may interject here again, I just want to relate to whatever we are talking about right now to the main topic of discussion, which is cyberspace. So what you were saying, if you don't adapt quickly in the cyber world, you'll be done. So the idea, if you want to survive in the cyberspace, you have to adapt.
Because the demands from these companies are changing rapidly. Like, think of 10 years ago, nobody cared about disinformation on these platforms at all, but disinformation existed on these platforms 10 years ago. But something huge happened with actual social and political implications that people suddenly realized that, oh, there's this thing called disinformation, and social media platforms help spread it a lot, right? So they had to adapt to this new kind of expectation, right? So,
all right, I'll have to give you the last word. Akin, thank you very much, Oleg, Mark, and Akin, for joining us on this important panel. Thank you for listening. I hope we had a great discussion. Just want to say, yes, cyber world is important, cyberspace is important, but let's also live in the real world. Let's not be, stuck to our phones all the time. Let's go out with our friends sometimes and have a cup of coffee. On that note, thank you very much, guys.